In this session, we'll be seeing what are import and export keywords. Now, you might have seen these appear several times in our previous sessions, and we have used them extensively, and they behaved like the carriers of ours, which basically took care of all the logistic work we had in our projects regarding taking a file from here to there and off from there to here. Now we'll be having some detailed analysis along with some corner cases that you might face while using these two keywords. So let's see what these are. Right guys, I hope you're able to see my screen now. So once again, we are back to this particular project in which we have my favorite superheroes, Batman, Daredevil, Wolverine. So basically an unordered list consisting of 3 elements, okay, and one header tag. So up till now, you have seen that in the previous session, we have used several little custom packets or components to split up our code. If you remember, we created another component folder inside this source folder. We created several files like app.jsx, header.jsx, and so on and so forth. So what was the actual intention of making them was to break down this particular code into smaller versions, or to divide this particular code into smaller segments and arranging these smaller segments in a much better and manageable fashion, and then using these two keywords called import and export, we somehow managed to merge all of those components back to create the initial web page. So in this particular session, our main focus will be to understand about these import and export keywords in depth. So if we get started, let's create this session very minimalistic. Our basic agenda is to understand what is the core functionality of them, what all optional let's say features or syntax practices we ought to use regarding these import and export keywords, and how to basically incorporate those smaller pieces of code with their own unique functionalities into the main project. So let me create a new file here and let us call it custom.js. So we are just creating a plain JavaScript file right here, and in order to get started, let's create a constant called date here, and we'll not be using the JavaScript function in here. Let's say this date is some sort of like 0101 2020. Okay, so just like in a rough format, I'm representing 1st January of 2020, and if you see, this date is not in any other like identifiable format. This is just basically represented as sort of an integer stored in a constant called date. And since we are not using any sort of React code in this, so we have to just call export default date. Now some of you might be having the question, what is the, like, we understood what is export. Import is to incorporate some other piece of code into the current directory, and export is to like expose this particular code for some other directory to access it. But what is the use of this default word right here? So we'll see in a moment. Now heading back to here, what we do is we'll write import, and the name of that constant was date, and now we mention the path where it is located. So it's called custom. So in order to add JavaScript right here, I'm gonna call date like this. Date, I'm importing this from, let's call it custom.js as of now, and const date is like this. Let me save it. Okay, let me remove the 0 from here, and now you can see this particular date is now being represented of this particular integer. So what we basically just did is we created one constant called date, we exported it from custom.js, we imported it inside index.js, and we represented it here using the curly braces, and now date is being rendered right here. All right, so we are basically incorporating a code from some other file or directory into this particular directory. Okay, now let's see what little tweaks we can make with this import one. Now let's first talk about the default keyword. So in index.js, whenever you are importing or whenever you are using any constant or a function or anything which is exported as a default, you can name it whatever you want. Let's call it whatever and it will work just fine as long as you remember to keep these two the same, like whatever name you are giving this particular constant. In this case, you have to use precisely that one wherever you are using it or incorporating it in your code. So that's a no-brainer. The new thing that we are going to learn now is this one. Let's say I'm creating a function right here, and the name of this function is say hello. So what this function is doing is, this is not doing anything basically, it's just returning a string hello. All right, now up till now, whatever component we have used, we have seen that we use this export default and ... whatever we are exporting. But now we have two things that we want to export from this custom.js file. So question number one, is it possible to export multiple the pieces of data or constants or functions or whatever from a file? And the answer is yes, you can export n number of functions or constants or stuff that we require or what we want. But what is the catch here? The catch is, let's call this say hello. Okay, so this way you can export, and let's say you are having some other functions, you can do like this. Okay, so let's do one more thing here just to demonstrate to you. Let me copy this and paste it like this, and let's say this is going to say world and say world, and like this we are exporting two functions and one constant. Now the catch here is that for every particular file you can have only one default export and n number of other exports that you want. Now what's the difference between this default export and exports like this? So what we can do is, right here, if we are importing these things, all right, let's keep it like this. Let's say we are calling it date, and now what we can write is import and say hello, or we can write say world from custom, and right here we can say hello. Now we know that say hello is a function, and we are not allowed to just write a function inside this JavaScript. So in order to display the value, we need to call this function. Similarly, let's do say word right here, we call it, and you can see say hello, say world, both of these functions as well as this date is now being represented here. Now, one new thing that we learned is that you can only have one default export per file, okay, and you can have any number of other exports. But previously we've seen that whenever the default export is concerned, we can name it whatever we want. All right, like we saw, like we renamed this whatever, we changed this with whatever, it was working just fine. However, in this case, you cannot say it like say WRLD or like only say. When you're importing another functions or constants which are not marked under default, the important thing to remember is that the name of those functions should be precisely the same. But we have one loose end here, or let's say one feature that comes to our rescue, and that is the order in which these functions or constants of these exports you put here. It doesn't matter. As you can see here, initially I'm exporting say hello first and say world later, but in this case I'm importing say world first and say hello later. Let's say we had 2, 3, 4 and so on more functions right here. It doesn't matter in which order we export it. It doesn't matter in which order we import it. The only thing to keep in mind is to keep these words of these functions or variables precisely the same as compared to whatever we used in this custom.js file. Okay, now moving on, what further thing we can tweak in this import right here. So let's say someone is saying, okay, what if I get a lot of functions right here or a lot of exports right here? So there is one method by using wildcard to import your stuff, but in this you have to give this wildcard a name. Let's call this wild from custom. Now what actually this wild variable, is this a variable or is this a string? What actually is this? So whenever you are in doubt about regarding a particular word or something that you are not sure what it contains, so the best thing is to just log it on the console. So if you see right here, we can see that this wild or this wildcard right here, it is actually an object, right? And what is contained inside this object? We have a say hello property, which is a function, say world property, which is another function, and a default key which contains this particular number as the value. Okay, so now we know that wild or whatever name we've given this wildcard is actually an object. And how do we tap into these properties of object or these functions and this constant that whatever is kept inside it? We just append the dot operator right here, and in order to access the date, we exported it as a default. So we'll write dot default, and in this case we will write wild dot say hello, and for say world we can write wild dot say world. Now you can see our code is back to its initial point. It's working as expected, as it was doing initially. But there's one thing to take care of, and that is that as per the recommended practices, this particular use of wildcard is not preferred. All right, now what is the reason of this? Let's take an example of like real life scenarios. So most of the time whenever you are creating some sort of component, so it's not the case that it will contain such less number of lines. All right, it will also contain a considerable amount of code, a considerable amount of logic inside it, but in most of the cases we won't be requiring it in our project. So let's say you have 100 functions declared inside this custom.js or this particular component, and you only require 5 of them. So it is not considered a good practice to use these wildcards. Let me remove them, and okay, oops, like this, and it will work exactly the same. So in this particular session, what we learned, let me change displays first. So how did it go? I hope you were able to grasp all the concepts taught and build the muscle memory along with it. And if you have any queries with respect to this, or you have any suggestions for us, feel free to use the comments section down below. And for this session, that will be all from my side. I'll see you in the next one.